What if the tea you drink every morning isn't quite as simple as you think? You wake up, boil some water, drop a tea bag into your cup, and within minutes you have a drink that feels completely harmless. Tea has spent decades building a reputation as the healthy alternative, something natural, calming, and even good for you. But when we started looking beyond the front of the box and into the ingredients, sourcing, processing, and testing behind some of America's most popular tea brands, we found a much more complicated story. And before we continue, there's something important to understand. This isn't about telling you that every tea bag is dangerous. It isn't about taking one laboratory finding and turning it into a scary headline. A chemical being detected doesn't automatically mean a product is unsafe. The concentration, exposure level, regulatory limits, and scientific evidence all matter. What we're investigating is something different. How much do consumers actually know about the tea they're drinking? Because a box might say natural, organic, pure, premium, or wellness. But those words don't tell you everything about where the leaves came from, how they were processed, what was used during cultivation, or what materials were used to make the tea bag itself. And that's where this gets interesting. Some of these brands have been trusted by American families for decades. Some have built their reputations around health and wellness. Others sell themselves as premium alternatives to ordinary supermarket tea. But when you put these brands side by side, the differences aren't always what you expect. Today, we're examining 10 major tea brands available to American consumers, looking at their ingredients, sourcing, ownership, certifications, packaging, and publicly available information. We're not asking you to panic. We're asking you to look closer, because the biggest surprise in this investigation may not be what's inside the tea. It may be how little the average consumer knows about it. Let's start at number 10 with Tetley, one of those tea brands that almost feels invisible because it has been around for so long. You see the familiar box in supermarkets, you recognize the name, and for many families, it's simply the tea that has always been in the kitchen cabinet. There's no dramatic wellness story you have to understand and no complicated decision involved. You buy it, boil the water, drop in the bag, and move on. And that familiarity is exactly what makes Tetley interesting for this investigation. When a product becomes part of a daily routine, people stop questioning it. They don't normally turn the box around and examine every ingredient, research where the leaves were grown, or ask how the tea bags themselves were manufactured. They simply assume that something this common must be straightforward. Tetley is part of Tata Consumer Products, a large international consumer goods company with tea and other food and beverage businesses across multiple markets. That means the tea you drink isn't necessarily coming from one farm or one small producer. Like most major tea brands, Tetley relies on a large agricultural and processing network. Tea leaves can be grown in different regions, harvested, dried, processed, blended, packaged, and transported before they ever reach an American supermarket. And because tea is an agricultural crop, pesticide use during cultivation is something consumers should understand. The important point, however, is that detecting a pesticide residue does not automatically mean a product is dangerous. What matters is the concentration, the applicable regulatory limit, and the evidence surrounding exposure. There's also another part of the product that most people completely ignore: the tea bag itself. Consumers usually think about what's inside the bag, but the bag is also a manufactured food contact material. Some paper tea bag manufacturing processes have historically used wet-strength chemicals such as epichlorohydrin, which has attracted regulatory and scientific attention because of its hazardous properties in other contexts. That doesn't mean every tea bag exposes you to a dangerous dose, and it shouldn't be presented that way. But it does raise a reasonable consumer question. What materials are actually being used in the bag you're steeping in boiling water? And that's the bigger lesson with Tetley. The familiar name on the front doesn't tell you the entire story. The tea leaves, the agricultural process, the supply chain, the testing, and the bag material are all part of the product. And once you start looking at tea that way, even the most ordinary box on the supermarket shelf becomes worth investigating. At number 9, we have Harney & Sons. And this is where the story becomes more interesting, because we're moving from a familiar everyday tea into the premium category. Harney & Sons has built its reputation around carefully selected teas, distinctive blends, attractive tins, and the feeling that you're buying something more sophisticated than an ordinary supermarket tea bag. People often choose it when they want to upgrade their tea routine. The packaging looks refined, the flavors sound carefully designed, and the higher price can create an immediate assumption. If I'm paying more, the ingredients and sourcing must also be better. But that's exactly the assumption we need to question. A premium price doesn't automatically guarantee a premium supply chain. Tea is still an agricultural product, whether it comes in a basic cardboard box or an expensive decorative tin. The leaves can come from international growing regions, pass through processors and blending facilities, and eventually become part of a finished product that looks completely different from the crop it started as. That's not unusual or necessarily a problem. It's simply how modern food production works. The important question is what the company can actually document about that process. Where were the leaves grown? What standards were used during cultivation? How are pesticide residues monitored? Are there meaningful certifications? Does the company provide information about sourcing and quality control? And if you're buying a tea bag rather than loose leaf tea, what exactly is the bag made from? That last question is easy to overlook. When most people hear tea ingredients, they think about the leaves and any flavoring added to them. They don't think about the small bag sitting directly in their boiling water. But packaging materials are part of the overall product experience, and consumers increasingly want to know whether their tea bags contain plastic, use particular fibers, or rely on manufacturing chemicals. None of this means that Hani & Sons tea should automatically be considered unsafe. That would be an unsupported conclusion. The more reasonable point is that a premium image should not replace evidence. If you're paying several times more for a product because you believe you're getting better quality, you should be able to ask what that extra money represents. Is it better tea, better sourcing, better testing, better packaging, or simply better branding? That's the question Hani & Sons raises in this investigation. The beautiful tin tells you how the brand wants to be perceived. The ingredient list and sourcing information tell you what you can actually verify. At number 8 is Stash Tea, a brand that built much of its identity around the natural food movement and the idea of tea being a more thoughtful alternative to ordinary supermarket brands. Founded in Portland in the 1970s, Stash became particularly popular with consumers who wanted distinctive blends and a more natural image. For many long-time customers, choosing Stash wasn't simply about flavor. It was about trusting the philosophy behind the brand. But that raises an important question. Does the current product still match the original image? Stash is now owned by Yamamoto Yama, a much larger Japanese tea company. That doesn't automatically make the tea better or worse, but it does mean today's supply chain is different from the small independent operation people may associate with the brand's early years. And that's important because tea can travel through a surprisingly complicated supply chain. Leaves and herbs may come from different countries, pass through processing facilities, get blended with other ingredients, and eventually be packaged for American consumers. The box may look familiar for years, even while the business and sourcing arrangements behind it change. Some Stash products also carry organic certification. That's useful information, but consumers should understand exactly what an organic certification covers. It relates to specific agricultural and production standards. It isn't a guarantee that every possible contaminant has been tested for, nor does it automatically answer every question about packaging materials. This is where Stash becomes interesting in our investigation. The brand's original reputation can create an assumption that the product has been independently verified to a higher standard simply because it has a natural image. But reputation and verification are two different things. If you're buying Stash because you believe you're getting a carefully sourced product, take a moment to check the current ingredient list, certifications, sourcing information, and any quality control details the company makes available. The lesson isn't that Stash is unsafe. The evidence doesn't justify that blanket claim. The lesson is much simpler. Don't assume a brand's history tells you everything about the product sitting in your kitchen today. The packaging may preserve the original story, but the only way to understand the modern product is to look at what the company is actually selling now. At number 7 is Twinings, one of the most recognizable tea names in the world. The company traces its history back to 1706, and that heritage is a major part of its appeal. When consumers see the Twinings name, they're not just thinking about tea, they're thinking about centuries of experience, traditional British tea culture, and a reputation built over generations. But there's an important distinction between heritage and modern product verification. Today, Twinings operates under Associated British Foods, a large international company with businesses across multiple industries. That doesn't automatically mean the tea is lower quality. It simply means the modern company should be evaluated based on its current sourcing, testing, ingredients, and manufacturing practices, not solely on the history printed on the box. Tea is an agricultural product, so pesticide residues are one area consumers may reasonably want to understand. The presence of a detectable residue doesn't automatically mean a tea is unsafe. What matters is the amount detected, the applicable regulatory limit, and the scientific evidence surrounding that exposure. The problem is that ordinary shoppers rarely have access to detailed batch-level testing information while standing in a supermarket aisle. Instead, they're making purchasing decisions based largely on the brand's reputation. And that's where Twinings becomes interesting. A brand can have hundreds of years of history, but that history can't independently prove what's inside today's tea bag. The product still depends on modern farms, suppliers, processing facilities, packaging, transportation, and quality control systems. There's also the tea bag itself. Consumers often focus entirely on the leaves and forget that the bag is another material coming into contact with hot water. Anyone concerned about packaging should look for the manufacturer's current information about what its bags are made from and how they're produced. So the lesson from Twinings isn't that centuries of experience mean nothing. Quite the opposite. The history explains why consumers trust the brand so strongly. But trust and verification aren't the same thing. The next time you pick up a box because the name feels familiar and reliable, remember that the history on the package describes where the company came from, not necessarily everything about the product you're buying today. At number 6 is Allegro Tea, a brand that gets an extra layer of trust simply because many consumers associate it with natural and organic grocery shopping. When people see Allegro on the shelves of a health-focused retailer, they may assume the product has already gone through a higher level of scrutiny than ordinary supermarket tea. But here's the important distinction. The reputation of the store and the certification on the product are not the same thing as independent verification of everything inside the package. Some Allegro products carry organic certification, and that certification does matter. It means the product is produced according to defined organic standards. But an organic seal doesn't automatically answer every question a consumer might have. It doesn't mean the tea has been tested for every possible contaminant, and it doesn't necessarily tell you everything about the materials used in the tea bag or the complete supply chain behind the finished product. That's why consumers shouldn't stop their research at the word organic. Look at the ingredient list. Check where the ingredients are sourced. Look for information about testing and quality control. And if you're particularly concerned about tea bag materials, see whether the company provides information about what its bags are made from. There's another interesting psychological effect here. When you buy a product from a store you've trusted for years, you may spend less time questioning the individual product. The retailer's reputation becomes part of the product's reputation. But ultimately, the tea still needs to stand on its own. That doesn't mean Allegro Tea is unsafe. We shouldn't make that claim without strong evidence. The real takeaway is that a health-focused retailer can help you find products, but its reputation shouldn't replace your own evaluation of the product. If you're paying more because you believe you're getting a cleaner or more carefully sourced tea, it's reasonable to ask what that additional cost actually represents. Because the package can communicate quality in a few seconds. The evidence takes a little longer to read. At number 5 is Tazo Tea, a brand that built its identity around making tea feel more sophisticated, creative, and carefully selected. Its packaging, unusual flavor combinations, and premium positioning helped it stand apart from basic supermarket tea. For many shoppers, picking up Tazo feels like choosing a more thoughtful option rather than simply grabbing the cheapest box on the shelf. But Tazo has an interesting corporate history that most consumers probably don't think about. The brand was originally founded independently in Portland in 1994. Starbucks later acquired Tazo, helping turn it into a much more recognizable name. Then, in 2017, Starbucks sold Tazo to Unilever. That ownership change matters because Unilever also owns major tea brands, including Lipton. Now, that doesn't mean Tazo and Lipton are automatically identical. Different brands can have different recipes, suppliers, specifications, and quality standards, even when they're owned by the same parent company. But it does raise an important consumer question. How different is the product from what the branding makes you believe? Tazo is positioned as a more elevated tea experience. Lipton is positioned as an everyday mainstream tea. The packaging, flavors, and marketing are completely different. But ownership shows us something important about the modern food industry. Two products that look like competitors on the supermarket shelf can sometimes belong to the same corporate family. And that's why consumers should look beyond the front of the box. If you're paying more for a premium tea, ask what you're actually getting for that extra money. Is it higher quality tea leaves, different sourcing, more detailed testing, better packaging? Or are you mainly paying for flavor, presentation, and brand positioning? None of those things are necessarily bad. Companies are allowed to build premium brands, and consumers are free to pay for the experience they prefer. But premium packaging shouldn't automatically be interpreted as proof of superior safety or sourcing. Tazo's story is ultimately about perception. The brand can feel completely separate from conventional supermarket tea, yet its corporate history tells a more complicated story. And that's becoming a recurring theme in this investigation. The picture on the front of the box tells you what the brand wants you to see. The ownership, sourcing, ingredients, and documentation tell you what you should investigate. At number 4 is Lipton, probably the most familiar tea brand on this entire list. For generations, Lipton has been the default tea in countless American kitchens. It's affordable, easy to find, and familiar enough that most people don't even think of it as a product they need to investigate. You simply see the yellow box, put it in your cart, and assume you already know what you're getting. And that's exactly what makes Lipton interesting. When a product becomes part of a family's routine for decades, the brand name itself can become a substitute for research. Parents give it to their children, families make iced tea with it during summer, and adults may drink several cups every day without ever looking closely at the label. But Lipton, like other mass-market tea brands, relies on a large international agricultural supply chain. Tea leaves can come from different growing regions, and agricultural crops can be exposed to pesticides during cultivation. Again, the important distinction is that the detection of a pesticide residue doesn't automatically mean the tea is unsafe. What matters is the amount, the applicable safety limits, and the evidence surrounding exposure. There's also a second part of the product that consumers rarely consider, the tea bag. When you drop a Lipton tea bag into boiling water, you're not only steeping the leaves, you're also putting the bag itself in direct contact with that hot water. That makes the material used to manufacture the bag relevant to consumers who want to understand the complete product. This doesn't mean you should assume that every Lipton tea bag is releasing a dangerous substance into your cup. Claims like that require specific evidence about the exact product, material, exposure level, and applicable standards. But it does raise a reasonable question. What is the bag actually made from? That's something many consumers never think to investigate, because tea has always felt so simple. And that's really the story with Lipton. The biggest issue isn't that the brand is automatically bad. It's that familiarity can make people stop asking questions. The yellow box has been around for so long that it almost feels like part of the kitchen itself. But familiar doesn't mean fully understood. And as we move into the top 3, the brands become even more interesting. Because we're no longer looking at tea marketed simply as a beverage. We're getting into products that are specifically marketed around health, wellness, sleep, and personal well-being. At number 3 is Yogi Tea. And this is where the investigation gets more serious, because Yogi doesn't simply sell tea as a beverage. Many of its products are built around specific wellness themes. You see names associated with detox, bedtime, stress relief, immune support, digestion, and other health-focused goals. That creates a very different expectation in the mind of the consumer. Someone buying a regular black tea is usually thinking about taste and caffeine. Someone buying a detox or stress relief tea is making a more intentional decision. They're choosing the product because they believe the ingredients have a particular purpose. And that's why transparency matters even more here. Yogi's packaging uses Ayurvedic-inspired language and carefully selected herbs to create a strong wellness identity. That doesn't automatically mean the products don't work, nor does it mean every ingredient is harmful. But consumers should separate traditional wellness claims from scientifically established medical benefits. For example, the word detox sounds powerful, but the human body already has organs such as the liver and kidneys that handle detoxification. Drinking a tea marketed as a detox product doesn't automatically mean it is medically cleansing your body. The same principle applies to sleep, immunity, digestion, and stress. Certain herbs may have research behind specific effects, but the strength of evidence can vary considerably from one ingredient to another. That's why the ingredient list becomes much more important with yogi than it might appear at first glance. If you're buying a wellness tea, don't just read the name on the front. Look at every herb listed on the back. Understand what you're actually consuming, especially if you're drinking it frequently or using medications that could interact with certain botanicals. And there's another lesson here. A wellness-focused package can create a stronger sense of trust than the evidence itself. The beautiful colors, traditional imagery, and carefully chosen names all communicate a message before you ever investigate the ingredients. That doesn't make the branding dishonest. It means consumers need to look beyond the branding. Yogi tea isn't automatically something you should avoid. But if you're buying it because you believe the box represents a specific health benefit, take an extra step and research the ingredients behind that claim. Because when a tea is marketed as more than just a drink, the standard for understanding what's inside should be higher, not lower. At number 2 is Celestial Seasonings, a brand that has built one of the strongest wholesome images in the American tea aisle. Since its beginnings in the late 1960s, the company has been associated with herbal teas, colorful packaging, calming blends, and products designed around everyday wellness. And for many consumers, that image is powerful. Think about the famous Sleepy Time Bear, the chamomile blends, and the peaceful scenes printed across the boxes. These products don't just look like tea. They look like something you would confidently give to your family when someone wants to relax before bed. But that raises an important question. Does a wholesome image tell you everything you need to know about the product? Celestial Seasonings is owned by the Heinz Celestial Group, a large publicly traded company with numerous natural and organic food brands. Again, corporate ownership isn't automatically a negative. Large companies can have extensive quality control systems and established safety procedures. But once a brand becomes part of a much larger organization, consumers shouldn't assume that its original small company image tells the entire story of today's supply chain. This is especially relevant with herbal tea because the ingredients can be much more diverse than ordinary black or green tea. A single blend might contain chamomile, peppermint, herbs, flowers, spices, or other botanicals sourced from different suppliers and growing regions. Every ingredient brings its own agricultural and processing history. And that's why consumers should pay attention to the actual ingredient list rather than relying entirely on the peaceful imagery on the box. There's another important distinction here. A product being marketed for sleep or relaxation doesn't make it a medical treatment. If you're drinking an herbal blend because you enjoy the flavor or find it relaxing, that's one thing. But if you're using it specifically to treat a health problem, it's worth understanding the evidence behind the individual ingredients and considering whether they could interact with medications or other products you're taking. Celestial Seasonings therefore represents one of the biggest lessons in this investigation. A product can look extremely natural. It can have a decades-long reputation. It can sit in the natural section of a supermarket, and it can still deserve the same basic scrutiny as every other packaged food. Don't judge the tea by the bear on the box. Read what's actually inside. And now we're down to number 1. The brand that may surprise you the most because it's one of the cheapest and most familiar options on the shelf. And at number 1 is Great Value Tea, Walmart's store brand. It may seem like an obvious choice simply because it's inexpensive, but that's exactly why it deserves attention. Millions of Americans choose store brands because they need to stretch their grocery budget. Buying cheaper tea doesn't mean they don't care about quality. It means price matters. The bigger question is how much information consumers can actually find about what's behind that low price. Great Value Tea provides the standard product information consumers need, but shoppers may not find the same level of detailed sourcing information associated with some specialty tea companies. The box doesn't necessarily tell you every farm, supplier, processing facility, or testing detail involved before the tea reaches the shelf. But here's the important point. Cheap doesn't automatically mean unsafe, and expensive doesn't automatically mean better. A premium tea may cost more because of its packaging, branding, sourcing, or specialty ingredients. A store brand may cost less because it spends less on marketing and brand positioning. So don't judge Great Value or any tea based on price alone. Instead, turn the box around. Check the ingredients, certifications, sourcing information, and any quality documentation the company provides. And that's the biggest lesson from this entire investigation. Don't trust the cheapest tea just because it's cheap. Don't trust the most expensive tea just because it looks premium. And don't trust a wellness claim just because it sounds healthy. Read the label, check the evidence, and make your choice based on information, not fear or packaging.